Great. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Tuesday night Parsha class. I hope you had a week of bracha and of simcha, of health, of growth. Tonight's class, first of all, I want to thank deeply from the bottom of my heart Helen Brown, who is generously sponsoring tonight's class. In honor of the yahrzeit of her fifth yahrzeit of her late husband, David Brown, Zichrono Livracha, may his neshama have an aliyah. Close friend, a close member of our community, and a dear, dear person in Sher Shemayim, as well as in commemoration of the yahrzeit of her late father, Sam Spiegel, Zichrono Livracha, may his neshama also have an aliyah. And Helen, may you and your whole entire family be blessed with long life and good health. I'd also like to suggest that if we can, that we also dedicate this year as well to Aharon Svi ben Razel, a member of our shul, Aaron Rifkind, who is in need of Refuat Hashem, Refuat Nefesh, Refuat Guf. And so I hope the zchut of our Torah study tonight should be for a zchut, for Refuat Shalema for him. So as you remember, I want to mention something else before we start. So next Tuesday, of course, there will not be a class because it's Purim. And so you should not be available at 8 p.m. for a class when you should be having your Purim Suda. So next week, we will not. But following that, we're going to be having two classes, March the 10th and March the 17th. Now, the March the 17th class will also not be about the Parsha. March 17th class will be about Haggadah insights and messages. For a few years now, I've been doing a shiur before Pesach on the Haggadah, and I invite you to come and maybe invite other friends. I usually try to give a whole bunch of divrei Torah that you might like and want to share at some point during the Seder that you have. So that's on March the 17th. That's going to be Tuesday night, again at 8 o'clock. That's on Pesach, Haggadah Insights and Messages. And that will be the last shiur before Pesach, and we will pick up after. But I just want to remind everybody, so next Tuesday, there is no shiur. March the 10th, there is a shiur. March the 17th is on Haggadah Insights and Messages, and that will be the last one, March the 17th, before Pesach. Okay. So tonight's shiur, as I told you last time, is not on the Parsha, which is Parsha Tetzaveh, Parsha Zachor. We're going to talk about Purim. And I want to try a different approach a little bit and see how that works out. What I want to do is I want to talk about Megillat Esther, but I want to do it this way. I'm hoping everybody will be okay with it. This is such a fascinating book. And there's no way in an hour I'm going to be able to really do it justice. So what I like to do tonight is just do Perek Aleph, the first Perek. We're not going to go pasuk pasuk, but we are going to talk about a lot of things in Perek Aleph. And maybe this will be a multi-year project. So this year maybe it'll be Perek Aleph, other years it'll be combination. It may take us a little while, but hey, if it draws people to come back next year, then it's a good thing. So I do want to start that way. And tonight, near Tzah Hashem, we'll take a look at Perek Aleph. So let me just a couple of words of introduction. We're not going to jump right into the Megillah right away. I think that the most popular attitude or feelings that we have about Purim is its lightheartedness, its joyous character. We're all invited to a Purim carnival, a Purim party. There's lachaims. We get dressed up. There's a lot of levity. The kids are having a good time. We're giving out mishloach manot. We're receiving mishloach manot. There's candies. There's so much about Purim that stimulates joy, and it should be, but not enough time is spent on actually studying the story. And I want to take a look at it because there are parts of the story that once we understand them and unpack them a little bit, so much more of the story is understood and so much depth of the story is understood. I think sometimes one aspect of Purim is lost in the joy and the levity that we bring to it, as we should. But tonight, in addition to the levity and the Simchat Purim, I hope that we'll have a chance to sort of explore a little bit about the story itself and some of its messages. So let's just try to place the story in a bigger historical context. So everybody is aware, of course, that Shlomo HaMelech constructed the first Beit HaMikdash. So exactly when that Beit HaMikdash was completed, so historians differ. Some say 957 BCE, before the Common Era. Some say 836 before the Common Era. But it is in the 8th or 9th century before the Common Era. The first Beit HaMikdash stood for over 400 years until its destruction in the year 586 before the Common Era. And the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, the first Beit HaMikdash was destroyed by the Babylonians. And the king who destroyed it, it was his rule, was Nebuchadnezzar. So that was in 586 BCE. The first Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, and many Jewish residents, as we know from historical accounts, both Jewish as well as outside historical accounts, describe how Jews were forcibly chained and tied and forced out of the country in a forced exile and were taken to Babel, were taken to Babylon, which, of course, as we know today, that landmass exists, but not the name. Babylon is no longer called Babylon. It is, however, the area, as you probably know, made up largely of Iran and part of Iraq. So that is where the great Jewish community lived. Now, about 70 years, after the destruction, permission was given for the Jews to return. Now, let's just stop a second, a little bit of history. Nebuchadnezzar was the Babylonian king under whose rule the first Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. There were three kings who technically, three major kings who ruled before the Babylonian Empire itself was overrun by the Persian Empire. So the last of the Babylonian kings to rule was Belshazzar. He was the last of the Babylonian kings. The Persians defeated them, and they had a series of kings who ruled. Koresh, Darius, and finally Achashverosh. And so the story of Purim that we know, the story that involves the characters, and Achashverosh is one of them, takes place after the Babylonians destroyed the Beit HaMikdash. Koresh, the first of the Persian kings, who was disposed more kindly to let ethnic groups express themselves, allow the Jews who were living in exile, remember they were forced out of the country by Nebuchadnezzar. They're living in an area that is now under Persian control because the Persian Empire defeated the Babylonian Empire. And Koresh allowed the Jews, or Cyrus as he's referred to in the general history accounts in English, allowed the Jews of Persia to go back to Israel and even begin rebuilding the Second Temple. Now, there were hundreds of thousands of Jews, huge population, living in Babylon, which later became part of the Persian Empire. And the stories that we know from our Tanakh, this is the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah, tell us that only about 40,000, only 40,000 out of hundreds of thousands wanted to go back to live in Israel. The rest remained in what we call the diaspora. The story of Purim is under the, as we know in Megillat Esther, takes place with the third Persian king, Achashverosh, and it takes place in the mid-5th century BCE, 470, around there. I can't be 100% exact, but 470, around there, BCE, before the Common Era. That's when the story of Purim takes place. Okay, so we got a little bit about the history. Now, here's why the history is important. Our rabbinic sources, which are not intended to be history books, but they do reveal a lot about history, have some interesting details that once we begin to assimilate these details into our understanding of the Megillah, so many pieces seem to fit together in a fascinating way. So, as you all know from the story that we learned when we were little children to the story we read every year, Achashverosh had a wife, correct? And his wife was called, his first wife was called Vashti. Okay, great. And we're just introduced to her in the Megillah. But what's her place in the broader context of history? Well, here's the thing. According to our rabbinic sources, Vashti is the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar. So the king who destroyed the first Beit HaMikdash, his granddaughter is Vashti, who ends up being the queen of Persia, Achashverosh's wife. That piece of information is going to play out in a much more significant way when we begin to understand and unpack the first chapter of Megillat Esther. So with that little background, it's not intense and it's not obviously too detailed, but I think it's significant. Let's begin. So I do want to read the first little part to you. I'm going to read it in Hebrew, and I'm going to use the Art Scroll translation interpretation. You can feel free to follow along with whatever version you want. As I said, we're not going to be doing every verse in the first chapter. That's not how we're going to approach it. But I want everybody to hear these verses. So I want you to pay attention. It's like guided listening to every time the word, the name Achashverosh is mentioned, and notice whether or not there's any descriptors to the name. So here's it in Hebrew, and then I'm going to do it in English. Verse 1. Vayehi bimei Achashverosh, hu Achashverosh, hamolech mehodu ve'ad Kush, sheva ve'esrim umeya medina. And it came to pass in the days of Achashverosh, the Achashverosh who reigned from Hodu to Cush, over 127 provinces. That's verse 1. Verse 2. Vayamim ahem keshevet hamelech Achashverosh al kisei malchuto, asher b'Shushan habira, that in those days when the king Achashverosh sat on his royal throne, which was in Shushan, the capital. One more verse. Bishnat shalosh lemalcho asa mishteh lechol sarav avadav chel haras umadai hapartamim v'sarei hamedinot lifanav. In the third year of his reign, he made a feast for all his officials and his servants, the army of Persia and Media, the nobles and officials of the provinces being present. So we're going to stop there for a second. Okay, so let's put together what we know. We are introduced for the first time to the king. His name is Achashverosh. Now, just think for a minute in the way that you and I have been educated into the character and the personality of Achashverosh. And we know, of course, that kids dress up like the king. I think I'm correct in saying that much of the character development of Achashverosh within our tradition makes him seem like a bumbling, drunk king. And somehow he's not seen as decisive. He's not seen as strategic. He's seen as weak. He's seen as loving alcohol. He's seen as confused. He's seen as being somehow a pawn. Okay, it's an interesting perspective, but where does that come from? So I want to go back again and ask you the question that I asked you when we started reading. How is Achashverosh introduced to us, the readers, for the very first time? Now compare the first verse in which I read to the second. And here's the comparison. I'm going to read just the name. So it says in the first verse, he's called Achashverosh. He's the Achashverosh who rules. And then in the second verse, it says, and in those days when King Achashverosh sat on his royal throne. So right away, you have to wonder, the king is mentioned 3 times. The first 2 times, it just says his name, Achashverosh. The second time, it just says his name, Achashverosh. It's in the second verse where it's mentioned, but this time, Achashverosh is called King Achashverosh, Hamelech Achashverosh. Why? These sorts of discrepancies within biblical literature are always signs. The close reading of the text is always the hallmark of rabbinic understanding and interpretation. Things like this don't just happen because the writer, went to a writer's craft session or club and he's trying to write things with flair. There's a reason behind it. So let's go back and understand a little bit about Achashverosh and a little bit about his wife. See, what the Megillah is trying to tell us is that Achashverosh did not come from a royal family. He was a commoner of uncommon wealth, and he bought his way into the monarchy. He sort of manipulated events such that he became king, but not because he inherited the seat, the throne from a father. He wasn't a king through blood. His wife was. His wife was the granddaughter of a king and also the daughter of a king, one of the kings that followed Nebuchadnezzar. It was her grandfather who destroyed the temple. But it was Achashverosh who assumed rulership of Persia at a time where Persia was a great empire, but he, the king, wasn't really a king. And so the Megillah hints at that by introducing Achashverosh at the very beginning as Achashverosh. It's not until the second verse that he's called Hamelech Achashverosh, who rules over 127 provinces. Now, the 127 provinces, you can just imagine, covers an enormous expanse of the globe. Hodu is India, Kush is Ethiopia. So it's trying to tell us the expanse of the provinces over which Achashverosh ruled. And then here comes something fascinating. One of the first things that you and I need to know is that he made a party. But did you notice when he makes this party? Did that detail, did you pick it up? I want to read it again. I'm reading verse 3, Pasuk Gimel. Bishnat shalosh lemalcho asa mishteh. In the 3rd year of his reign. So what question ought we be asking? Why the 3rd year? Don't kings usually inaugurate their ascent to the throne with parties in the 1st year? Wouldn't that have made more sense? But the Megillah is telling us it's not in the 1st year. It's in the 3rd year. And I want to read it again. Bayamim hahem kishevet Hamelech Achashverosh. It was in those days, which now is the 3rd year, we understand, that he was sitting on his throne. What is the Megillah telling us about it was in those days? What were those days? And why did those days not begin at year 1? Why did it begin in year 3? So our Chachamim offer some insights. Again, these are textual oddities that force a critical thinking reader to stop and say, what lies beneath the text? What's the story beneath the text? And here's where the Midrash opens up a window into how the Chachamim understood the story. And once we get these details, so much more of the story that you and I are so familiar with takes on different meanings. The reason some of the Chachamim say that this is happening in the 3rd year is because he wasn't a legitimate king. And an illegitimate king can't just assume the throne. There were people who opposed him. Not only there were people opposing him, people were fighting against him. And it took to the third year for him to calm all these mini rebellions that were started as an opposition to somebody who really had no access to the throne, no claim to the throne. And so he couldn't sit, as it were, peacefully, calmly, and reign until he managed to what? Quash all those unrest in 127 provinces. So we're beginning the story with a king who is not legitimate. He was wealthy, but he's not a legitimate heir, and in all likelihood had to begin his reign trying to subdue those who sought to rebel against him. So let me just stop and pop something into your mind right now. With that piece of information, what part of the story not yet read do you think this helps to explain? And it's a story where we first encounter Mordechai and how Mordechai helped the Achashverosh. Do you remember the story? What did Mordechai overhear? He overheard Bigtan and Teresh plotting an assassination of the king. Do you remember that? And Mordechai then passed the information on to Esther, and Esther told the king, and the thing was checked, and the two people were killed, Bigtan and Teresh. Why were they doing that? That piece of information now fits in with the beginning of the Megillah, because likely Bigtan and Teresh were amongst those people who felt that Achashverosh had no right to the throne. They were amongst the people who felt that this man's an impostor and he's seeking to insert himself in the rulership of Persia, and he had no right to do so. And maybe they were part of the people who rebelled. And once Achashverosh, of course, heard this, he understood that things had not yet calmed down to the extent that he hoped. But that now helps us to understand. When Mordecai just overhears a plot to assassinate the king, where did that come from? It comes from the beginning of the Megillah and a challenge to the authority of the Melech from the very beginning. I just, I don't. Can you hear me? Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Now,
Okay.
yes.
I don't know whether or not my camera is working because I don't see myself on the screen anymore.
I
I just
think
lost
I think you were frozen, Rabbi.
I actually lost internet connection. Okay, that's all right. Let me see what we can do here.
I'm sure you're going to be fine.
Okay, let's try a little bit here. Thank you for your patience, everybody. Okay, are we back now? Okay, I hope we're back. So I want to go back. I'll just read this again. This is the description of the party that Achashverosh is making. And I just want you to pay attention who are invited to this part of the party. He made a feast for all of his officials and his servants, the army of Persia and Media, the nobles and officials of the provinces being present, when he displayed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days. Okay, 180 days. 180 days he made a party. and he was putting on display the riches and splendor of his excellent majesty. But who was invited to this? Did you pay attention? Who was invited? Not the common people were invited to this. He's inviting his officials, his servants, the army, the nobles, the officials of the provinces. Why is he doing this? If, as we said before, he's really not a legitimate king with a real authentic claim, then what's he trying to do? He's trying to buy favor. He's trying to buy favor. And who is he choosing to invite? All the people of influence that he needs to have as allies. You need to have the army. You need to have the officers, because he knows if there's a revolt and the army turns against him, he'll be assassinated. And so he's starting off in the third year. Again, he's managed to quiet everything down. And maybe there are people who were against him, and maybe there are people who were for him as allies. And now he's having this extraordinary party of 180 days, 6 months. He's having a 6-month party. And it's not like people are coming and going. He's inviting everybody for 6 months to stay. And you can just imagine what's going on. And then just a little bit more. And when these days were fulfilled, meaning it's at the conclusion of 180 days, the king made a week-long feast for all the people who were present in Shushan, the capital, great and small alike, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were hangings of white, fine cotton, and blue, held with cords of fine linen and purple, upon silver rods and marble pillars. The couches of gold and silver were on a pavement of green and white, and shell and onyx marble. The drinks were served in gold goblets, no two goblets alike, and the royal wine in abundance, according to the bounty of the king. And the drinking was according to the law, without coercion. For so the king had ordered all the officers of his house that they should do according to every man's pleasure. Okay, so that's a lot of detail. Usually the Tanakh is not as detailed. So when we read a story like that and we read all this detail, it's like a sign. Why? So let's try to see if we can unpack some of this. So there's a fascinating machloket in the Gemara between two great rabbis, Rav and Shmuel. And here's the machloket. One of them says, Melech Pikeach Haya. This man, this Achashverosh, he's not a fuddy-duddy. He's not a foolish man. He's not. He's politically and strategically aware. In what way? Well, look who he invited to the 180-day party. He invited all the officers throughout 127 provinces. Hikdim, I'm going to read from the Gemara itself. Hikdim mishteh harichokim mimishteh beniro. He gave preference to come first for those who lived in the outlying 127 provinces, Mehodu ad Kush, from India to Ethiopia, a huge expanse. And he invited all of those people living far away from the capital city of Shushan, he invited them first for a 180-day party. Why? This opinion in the Gemara says that was so strategic. That was clever. Why? Sheben iro kole machir tzeh yifasem. He says, because these people live far away. And he understood the strategic value of creating loyalty to a king who's not around. The king lives in Shushan. We don't live in Shushan. But invite them into a 100-day party, wine them and dine them, give them everything they want, give them compliments. And then when they go back home, they'll feel loyal. They'll feel a little bit of beholden to you. And because you don't have them near you all the time, because you don't have a personal relationship, it's best to first solidify those alliances than the people living in your city, whom you're going to be able to reach on a regular basis. You can always get access to the people in your hometown faster, more directly, more impactfully than you can to the officials living far away. And if, as we said before, he's not only he ascended the throne not through blood, but through revolt or through war, he knows just how important it is to make sure that he has the loyalty and allegiance of the outlying regions. That's one opinion. The other opinion says, Pikeach, no way, he's not smart. Tipesh. What does Tipesh mean? He's a foolish king. Why? Shahayalo lekarev b'nei iro kodem. He said, he should have first solidified the relationship with everybody in Shushan. He left them till the 7th month, 180 days with everybody else. Everybody else is partying. They're partying in Shushan. Everybody in Shushan sees a 6-month party, and they're not invited to it. He should have started with the people in Shushan first. Why? Because the likelihood of any rebellion against the king's authority is not going to start where the king lives, where he has a garrison, where he has the soldiers. It's likely to start outside, further away. Well, if there is a rebellion that starts in the perimeters and the outlying regions, who does he need to rely on to help quash the rebellion? Those people who are closer to him, who feel close to him. And if you are already feeling that there's a threat, if you're already feeling weakened because you think that you haven't ascended the throne through legitimate means, the people you want to have by your side are the people you can trust. And those are the people living in Shushan. Who are your neighbors? Who are the people you'll be seeing on a regular basis? It was a strategic error, says this opinion, for him to throw this party first for the outlying regions and everybody listed in the verses, then to hit the people living in Shushan. A fascinating machloket. So is he stupid? Is he wise, strategic, or is he foolish? Is he bumbling or is he clever? And you see that now Achashverosh is a much more nuanced character. There's so much more going on here. And because of Perek Aleph, we are now going to begin to understand a little bit about the psychology of the rest of the story. What's the psychology? If you have a king who's uncertain, insecure of himself, then so much more of the story makes sense. Like now I understand why he threw a 180-day party, because he felt that he somehow needed to buy favor with all of these people. Is that a smart thing to do? Not really sure. And the Pasuk tells us that not only did he, of course, put on display his wealth, and maybe he was trying to create the impression that if the king likes you, you'll get a chance to get some of this wealth. So literally buying favor in the eyes of all of these people. But the Megillah also tells us a little bit about the way in which this party ended up being conducted. So first there's the party for 180 days. So again, just a couple verses. He displayed the riches of his glorious kingdom, the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days. And when these days were fulfilled, the king made a week-long feast for all the people who were present in Shushan. We just talked about that. Great and small alike. He's not just talking about the officers. He's talking about the people whose support of him he may need. There were, one second, I want to skip a little bit. The drinks were served in gold goblets. We're going to come back to that in a second. No two goblets alike, and royal wine in abundance according to the bounty of the king. And the drink was according to the law without coercion, for the king had ordered all the offers of his house that they should do according to every man's pleasure. Lasot kiratzon ish ve'ish. So here, an interesting thing. The rabbis keep rereading that verse and try to understand kiratzon ish ve'ish. You're a king. You're a monarch. You're a ruler of one of the greatest empires in the world. What do you think your subjects want from you? What would give your subjects a sense of confidence? What does a loyal servant of a monarch or a king wants to see when he or she looks and gazes upon the king? What does a loyal servant want to feel when they're in the presence of a monarch? And the Chachamim wonder whether this is an example of the king feeling so insecure he missed the boat. What's the boat? He didn't act like a monarch. A true monarch lays down the law. It's my law. I'm the emperor. I'm the king. I make the law. And this verse says he did exactly the opposite. What did he do? He let everyone decide for themselves what they liked, as opposed to saying, you're in my home, I'm your king, you're my guest, but this is the way the emperor is going to conduct the party. In some ways, it's fascinating. Listen to the words of this midrash as the midrash tries to understand what was being conveyed by this Megillah. By the way, if you're thinking to yourself, who wrote the Megillah? That's a really good question. Not 100% sure. At the end of Megillah Esther, it talks about Esther and Mordechai writing something, but it doesn't seem that what they wrote was this. They wrote an Iggeret, they wrote a letter, summarizing the immediate events. But this story, called Megillat Esther, obviously was written during the time of the Persian Empire, but at a time following the whole unfolding of the story. And a lot of the scholars believe it was not necessarily written by Mordechai the Esther. We're not 100% sure. The Gemara doesn't come to a definitive answer about that. But here's an answer. Here's something that the Midrash says. Two people, Shnei B'nei Adam Mevakshim Lisaisha. Two men want to marry one woman. Can she be married to two of them, or only one at a time? Now, what's the Midrash saying? Midrash is saying that this idea of what the king did, everybody decide, is an example of indecisiveness. And nobody wants to have an emperor who appears to be indecisive. Two boats are approaching a harbor, and they have to pass. One is coming south, one is coming north, and there's not enough room in the canal for both to pass. So somebody's going to have to step aside, or not step aside. One boat will have to allow passage to the other boat. Can one sort of strong wind push both of them? Obviously not. The boat coming from the north needs a southerly wind, and the boat coming from the south needs a northerly wind. I get it. But again, the point being, you can't have both at the same time. And what the Midrash is suggesting is that this Midrash, this verse is talking to us about a king who can't make up his mind. And while he's trying to buy off favor, it may not be having the impact that he wants to have. So there's two ways of a king to sort of solidify his rule. One is through force and coercion. You're going to put down their rebellion. I'm going to create, well, we see that in the world today, right? That's what's going, this is going on in Persia right now, correct? That's where the IRGC is now, the Iranian Republican Guard, IRCG, whatever it is now killing civilians. I don't know how many thousands and thousands of civilians are killing. They're forcing behavior. They're forcing compliance. That's one way to get people to behave in a certain manner. And the other way, apparently the way that Achashverosh felt, was to endear yourself into the hearts of the people. And he chose the second. Okay. Remember we talked about the verse, no two goblets are alike. The drinks were served in gold goblets. So I don't know how many of you have a musical ear, but if you go to shul and you listen to the Baal Koreh laying this, you'll notice something fascinating. Megillat Esther has its own trop. It has its own notes, and they're chanted in a specific way. Every Megillah does. Megillat Esther has its own chant, and Megillat Eicha, that's the Megillah that's read on Tisha B'Av, the day in which the national day of observance of the destruction of the temple, has its own. When we get to the verses about the gold goblets, the Baal Koreh changes the musical chant. And instead of chanting those phrases, in the chant that is appropriate for Megillat Esther, when he gets to the excuse me, when he gets to the part the chelim mechelim shonim, and talking about the various vessels that are being used at this party, he changes it to read from the chant tune of Echa. Do you know why? The reason is because at this party, some of the vessels that were used for this party were vessels taken by Nebuchadnezzar from the Beit HaMikdash when he destroyed it in the year 586. And so here we have this extraordinary party, and the king, to demonstrate his wealth, demonstrate his power, is using some of the vessels that came from our Beit HaMikdash. By the way, the Gemara says something deeply profound here. Who was at this? Were the Jews there? The answer is yes. There were Jews who attended this party because they were invited, because they may have held whatever positions that made it appropriate for them to be there. Or they could have been simply in Shushan, and as residents of Shushan, it tells us that everybody in Shushan was invited. Everybody from important to not. And they're there. The Jews are there. They don't necessarily have to be eating food. I mean, it's not kosher food. I get it. But they were there. And the Gemara says something very, very upsetting. It says, what is it that brought about this whole Haman story? Like, what did the Jews do from a theological perspective that would have warranted, in the eyes of God, that would have warranted such devastating punishment, that would have made it necessary for God to bring about the circumstances around which Haman could have annihilated the Jewish people? What did they do? What did they do? And so one of the answers the Gemara gives was, yes, well, they came to this Su'udah and they enjoyed it. Not that they were eating treif food. They weren't. But they enjoyed themselves. They were at a Su'udah. Can you just imagine that? You were a Jew at a Su'udah, and the non-Jewish king, Achashverosh, whose wife is the granddaughter of the king who destroyed the Beit HaMikdash, they're bringing out gold vessels, and maybe they were even saying, oh, you know where we got this from? We brought this from this was taken from the Jewish temple in Jerusalem when they were destroyed by the Babylonians, 70, 80 years ago, whatever. And you're sitting there? You didn't get up and walk out? You're okay with that? You're okay enjoying yourself while you're watching the remnants of the destroyed temple being touted and used by a non-Jewish king? And also, just to point out, according to some Midrashic sources, remember I had started the introduction to the story of Esther by saying that permission was given by the Persian king Koresh to begin rebuilding the temple in Israel, 100%. But it was stopped. By whom? The Midrash says by Achashverosh. Why did Achashverosh stop it? Listen to this. This is a fascinating Midrash. Fascinating. The Midrash tells us about a conversation that takes place between Achashverosh and Vashti. And the conversation goes like this. Achashverosh, of course, was allowing the ongoing rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash following the edict by a preceding Persian king. His wife, Vashti, the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar, says to her husband, Achashverosh, what my grandfather had destroyed, you are prepared to undo by allowing it to be rebuilt? And she's, of course, taunting him and saying he has no right to try to, or to allow the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash because it was her grandfather, his wife's grandfather, who destroyed it. And so according to the Midrash, Achashverosh ordered the cessation of any efforts to rebuild the Beit HaMikdash again. And so here you are at this extraordinary party that the king, this lavish party that the king is sponsoring and inviting you to. And of course, you're not going to eat non-kosher food, but when you see these things, what do? Do you sit there or do you get up and walk out? So the Gemara says, the fact that nehenu misu'udat Achashverosh, that's the Hebrew word, nehenu misu'udat Achashverosh, they enjoy themselves at the Su'udah. That was just too much to bear. Too much to bear. Like I'm trying to think of a modern example, and I don't know. I'm not 100% sure what would a modern example be. What would have been so abhorrent to, I don't know, maybe things that the Nazis would have destroyed. Like if anybody started flying a swastika because you like the design and you like the colors, how could you do that? How could you do? Oh, it's a nice design. It's like, how can you do that? It only means one thing. It only means one thing: destruction of Jews, hatred of Jews. How can you allow that? So if you're at a party where the Beit HaMikdash, the vessels, the kelim of the Beit HaMikdash are being used for things other than intended, and you're okay with that, you're letting that flag fly and you're sitting there, can't do it. So the texture of Perek Aleph is now getting much richer. It's getting much more complex. It's getting much more nuanced. What's going on here? And then we get to the next part, which is an amazing part. And again, we pass this over and we think about, this guy is a drunk king. But listen to this. In light of all of the things we just described and all the midrashim that I'm sharing with you, now the next part of the first chapter of Megillat Esther just falls into place and takes on a completely different understanding. I'm going to read it. Gam Vashti Hamalka asta mishte nashim Beit HaMalchut asher lamelech Achashverosh. Vashti the queen also made a feast for the women in the royal house of King Achashverosh. I'm going to read it in English to save a little bit of time. On the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he ordered and then mehuman bista charvona bikta va'avakta zeitar v'charkas, the 7 chamberlains who attended King Achashverosh, to bring Vashti the queen before the king, wearing the royal crown, to show off to the people and the officials her beauty, for she was beautiful to look upon. Okay, let's just stop and try to figure this out. And there's so much in that little piece. So Vashti's making a party too. She's not with the king. King is having his own party. Sounds like it's for men, because Vashti's making a party for women. We'll talk about that in a second. And then the king, at one point, after he's had 187 days worth of partying, he says to bring Vashti to show off her beauty because she was beautiful. What's that about? What's that about? What's he really doing? Who is Vashti? Vashti is the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar. Obviously, she's Achashverosh's wife. But what's now being made more and more clear? Between the two of them, who really is royalty? She is, not him. And so when you read this story knowing that, and when you read this story thinking that there may be this underlying theme of the insecurity of the king, there may be this underlying theme that there are those forces in play in the kingdom of Parasu Madai, of people who are unhappy with the king. The king is looking to, as it were, exert himself. And so what he's doing, he's inviting people to look at his wife. So we're talking about 1 minute, but what maybe he really is trying to do is to humiliate his wife, who he seems to be having some conflict with. He is not really royalty. She is royalty. And he needed to demonstrate his superiority, his rulership, the fact that he can call the shots. He picks unusual ways and mistaken ways of doing this. And he calls her, and according to Chazal, of course, he calls her not only to come, he calls her to come not clothed. He wants to show off her beauty. Now, it's so interesting that the pasuk here, in describing the queen, describing Vashti, of course, says the following. He wanted to show off et yofia. ki tovat mar'ehi. So he wanted to show off her beauty because she was beautiful to look upon. Well, we just said that. He wanted to show off her beauty. It's not necessary to say because tovat mar'ehi. It's enough to say to show her beauty. So some of the commentaries, especially Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, wonder whether the reason that the author of the Megillah added that last description of her beauty was to sort of give us a hint that there's two types of beauty. There's obviously the physical beauty that is very striking, but there's another type of beauty, and that's not the physical beauty. That's the beauty that a person has on their character. And what the Megillah may be telling us is something about Vashti's character. And I know here is a wide diversity of opinion about Vashti and her character. Some saying that God made her grow a tail and to sort of humiliate her because she had humiliated other Jewish women. And we get on the other hand, you have somebody like Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, who makes a comment completely differently, very differently, and says, we're talking about Iran, we're talking about Persia. So what do you think the moral code was in Persia? Men and women didn't go together. Men and women were not partying together, says Hirsch. The queen who carries herself as a queen was not about to and not interested in showing her beauty off and being naked because she felt that was not appropriate. That's not the way it should be done. And so she holds herself up on a higher level of conduct than her husband does, the king. And so what you're seeing here is how the history of how Achashverosh ascended the throne vis-a-vis his wife is playing out in the story. And that's why, in fact, when we take a look at it, we see that his expectation, like who would expect that your wife, the queen, would come and debase herself in front of a bunch of people, men who've been drinking for 7 days or more? Like, why would you think that that's a sign of respect for you? And that's another example of how you wonder whether he is a strategic king or he's a bumbling king. On the one hand, you could say, for sure he's bumbling. On the other hand, you now begin to see that here plays out a little bit of the tension between Achashverosh and Vashti, who comes from a royal blood lineage. Okay, just going to go on a little bit more. So she, of course, refuses to come. Now, here's another example of something fascinating. It's the next part. So following the queen's refusal to attend, what does the verse tell us? Again, I'm going to read in English just to save time. Then the king conferred with the experts who knew the times, for such was the king's procedure to turn to all who knew law and judgment. Those closest to him were Karshana, Shetar, Admata, Tarshish, Meres, Marsana, Memuchan, the 7 officers of Persia and Media who had access to the king and who sat first in the kingdom, as to what should be done legally to Queen Vashti for not obeying the bidding of the king Achashverosh, conveyed by the chamberlains. So one of the things that maybe you're noticing, I noticed, is the king needs to confer with other people before he makes a ruling. Well, this isn't like a parliament. This is not like the liberals and conservatives and we're going to have a minority government because there'll be a vote of non-confidence and the government falls. Like, what are we talking about? We're talking about ancient monarchies where people got killed because the king said so. Later on, we saw that happen with Haman, right? When the plot is revealed by Esther at that fateful party, right away, Achashverosh says, kill the Haman. And later on, big top, like all the parts of the story, but why not here? Like, why? He's not demonstrating what people want to see in an emperor and a monarch. He's not demonstrating decisiveness. He's not demonstrating the ability of a king to act like a king. And so all of his glory that he tried to accomplish in 187 days, in some ways, is actually compromised. So when it came to deciding the fate of his wife, he needs to ask. And yet when it came to deciding the fate of the Jews regarding the quest of Haman, he didn't seek counsel from his advisors, right? Haman says, it doesn't pay to keep them. Let's kill them all. And he makes a decision by himself. He doesn't ask anybody, what do you think? You think it's a good idea? It's a bad idea? He decides after he gets whatever money he was given. It's right, 10,000 shekel as it says, but he makes the decision. And so he's a complicated person that has multiple sides to him. So there are those who defend the actions of Achashverosh by stating that since he was still drunk, he asked for his advisors so that he would not punish her excessively. But one of the commentaries, the Malbim says, he explains that with all of his anger, he truly wanted her acquitted because he loved her. He's complicated. He didn't want to kill her, but he felt he was pushed into a bit of a corner because she publicly humiliated him. So angry was Achashverosh at Vashti that he made his affairs public, which should normally remain between a king and his queen. Okay. I'm going to stop tonight here. I see it's already, I'm not going to go on. I'm just happy to have everybody share your thoughts about what you're hearing tonight, whether this is new for you. And I'm just really interested in how this is hopefully going to enrich the way in which you read the rest of the Megillah. I know we're going to have to wait till next year, but feel free to go read part of it, keeping in mind some of the things that we just discussed tonight, because as I said, if you keep that in mind, so much becomes clearer. For example, do you remember when Esther, what I don't know, I just lost everybody. Do you remember when Esther does the party? I don't know if you pointed, what was that about? Why did she have to create the party in order to sort of figure out how to overcome Haman's plan? What she was doing so cleverly was building on what she realized was his insecurity. She invites the king and she invites Haman together to an intimate party. So you can just imagine a king who believed that his own safety was in question. Don't forget, Bitan and Teresh tried to assassinate him. That he still thinks that there are those in his kingdom who seek his downfall. But why is his queen inviting this other minister to what ought to be an intimate party? And then you read the language. It's so fascinating how Esther manipulates him. And the language tells us that Haman's name sometimes precedes Achashverosh's name. It's as though that she wants him, Achashverosh, to sense that maybe Haman is part of some inner plot. And so all of this plays on the fact that Achashverosh may not have been a legit king, and how that might have been a psychological exposure that allowed Esther to create the environment in which she did what she did. Obviously, I think everybody understands all of this is part of Hashem's plan, clearly, 100%. But I'm happy for all of you to share some of your insights and questions and comments, and let's take it where it needs to go. I just find this fascinating. Thank you for listening, everybody. Anybody want to share some thoughts or insights with us at this point?
I think that he consulted his advisors because then he didn't have to take responsibility. He could blame them.
Right. That's definitely
whereas in some other actions, it's more the rage of the king that reigns.
Excellent. And that again, I think just points out that he's not a one-dimensional character. There's obviously tension here. There's things about him that are indications, as we saw in the Gemara. He can sometimes act strategically and what seems to be wisely, but other times he's just overcome by his own insecurities and weakness and does things for the wrong reasons.
Yeah, I would be insecure too if I did something like that.
Yes. Good point. Good point.
And maybe that was part of Esther's strategy, not just political insecurity, but also as a man.
I agree. I totally agree. I think she was playing him 100%. And it's very interesting, at the very beginning of the Megillah, certainly in Perek Gimel and the beginning of Perek Daled, Mordecai is the one who seems to be more in control and realizing what's happening and beginning to be a more active person. But from chapter 4 on, that changes, and it's Esther. Esther is the one who is really now moving and plotting and planning everything. And she understands what's at stake, and she understands the man that she's married to. And she uses whatever technique she can
Bina.
to beat him. Yeah, exactly. Exactly true. And of course, the part at the end is sometimes overlooked, unfortunately. But I think it's something that everybody should remember. So we're going to go to our Purim parties and we're going to dress up and we're going to have a l'chaim and we're going to sing songs and have our homentashim. And I can't get out of my mind that there was one beautiful midrash. It's a powerful midrash. And Esther is standing near the window of the palace. And she turns to God. And these are the words in the midrash, but I think the midrash is trying to convey this sentiment powerfully. And she says, Keli, Keli, lama azavtani. My God, why have you forsaken me? And she says, my foremothers, they were taken. Sarah was taken by Paro and then by Abimelech, and you saved them. You didn't let Paro hurt Sarah, and you didn't let Abimelech hurt Sarah. But me, you left me here in the king's palace. And at the end of the story, the end of Purim, everybody goes back to their life, but not Esther. She remains in the king's palace. Beautiful Jewish young girl with dreams like everybody else, raised to be, a Jewish woman with Jewish virtue and Jewish goals, but she gave her life for the Jewish people. And while we're all partying, Esther remains in the king's palace. And I think it's a bit of a sobering thought to think about that. That she truly was. She was the person. She saved the Jewish people from the final solution.
Sort of a martyr.
She gave her life. Yes, in a certain way, that is exactly it. She did. She knew what she was doing. And that's why chapter 4 is such a turning point where she realizes what's at stake and she knows what's going to happen. And yet she goes forward with this plan, knowing what
I have a question about the party.
Yeah.
Just the way you phrased it, it reminded me that, the laws of kosher wine, that it has to be mevushal.
Yeah.
But part of the reasoning behind it is because Hashem didn't want us to drink and break bread with the goyim.
Right.
And I'm wondering, when did that come in? Was it already at play and they violated that?
Well, that would have come in. That gets a lot more discussion in the Talmud Bavli, which hasn't been written yet. But there is an oral Torah that gets passed down. And I think that the Jews who went to the party didn't necessarily have to partake of the food and drink. So the Gemara says, did they eat and drink there? No. Some say that Mordecai was there and he made sure that the people there were eating quote unquote kosher food. Okay, good. But so if they were eating kosher food, why was their presence so questionable? And that's when the Gemara says, Yochanan ben Zakkai says that what was questionable was not what they were eating or drinking, because that was kosher. What was questionable was that they were enjoying themselves. Good question, Rhonda. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so I'd want to remind everybody, next week is Purim. I hope everybody has, as they say, a Freilich Purim. And, you know, everybody's got their eyes on what's going on in Israel. Everybody knows the Purim story. And I think that the Purim story teaches us that Hashem will never, never let the Jewish people be defeated. Never. And that's a promise we have from Hashem. And so may that
Baruch Hashem.
stand
Thank you.
for us all. May this be a week, hopefully, of peace. And may he protect our beloved country and our beloved family and friends. All Jews are family. And may he watch over us. Shomer Yisrael. May he continue to be a Shomer Yisrael, to make sure that we remain the eternal people. So thank you, everybody. I wish everybody a wonderful week. A reminder that listening to the Maftir this Shabbos is a mitzvah to say. Reading the Maftir of Zachor, the last three psukim of Parsha Tetzaveh, Shabbat Zachor, the Shabbos before Purim. So everybody should try to be at shul to hear the kriya, the laning of the Maftir, if you can. And if you can't, by the way, you can fulfill that mitzvah, because it is a mitzvah on Purim, by listening to the laning of the Torah on Purim morning itself. So it's preferable to do it at shul with the maftir. If you can't, then listen to the Kriya Torah on Tuesday morning when you get to shul. Wishing you all a wonderful week. Thank you so much for coming, and I look forward
Thank you
to
very much, Rabbi Diamond.
2 weeks, which is March the 10th. And please remember March 17th, Haggadah Insights and Messages. Good night, everybody. All the best.
Thank you very much. Good night.
That
Good night. Good night.